I was just thinking about in terms of at least like the background to the political dilemmas of in landscape of your life,
Hmm.
Adolph. That it had its roots in the 30s.
Hmm.
So at the beginning of this essay that you've published in Harper's, called Nothing Left, you say that the major period of the left's influence on the course of American politics was basically from the mid 30s to the end of the war, 1935 to 45.
Hmm.
And you say it was a prominent voice in the Democratic Party of the era. And you tie that to Roosevelt's promotion of a social agenda
Hmm.
with the left's influence. This was also probably the high point of the Communist Party when it promoted Popular Front tactics to defeat fascism and to forge a kind of um, alliance around support for the New Deal. And
Right.
this led to the left's subordination to the Democratic Party, from which arguably it's never recovered.
Hmm.
Is it fair to view this as the high point of American politics and simultaneously as, if not its greatest crisis, its last great crisis?
Um, yeah, that's interesting. I think um, I think it's almost certainly the case that it's its last great crisis, right? I mean, the reason that I'm kind of hesitant about this is that I'm actually arguing. Now, it occurred to me I should have sent you one of these chapters anyway,
Hmm.
but I'm but I'm making an argument, not a strong argument because it's not the main point, that there was a similar moment of lesser crisis that was lesser because actually the post-war crisis was the greatest, was the greater one, um, in the mid 60s, when once again, like the issue of how to make sense of economic inequality was close to emerging, basically, under the table. And in both cases, I'm arguing we get a response that's the effect of which is to um, shift discussion of inequality or social justice more affirmatively from the realm of political economy to the realm of culture, right? So, like in the late 40s, you get
Hmm.
the emergence and the consolidation of a new kind of racial, liberalism that's detached from 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 an understanding of racial inequality as rooted in the dynamics of American capitalist political economy to one that's rooted in a combination of 14th Amendment equal protection, state action against Jim Crow in the South, and psychology with bigotry and intolerance. In the mid '60s, you got something kind of like that, but in the language that a strain of a political scientist find appealing now. It's a path dependent outcome in the sense that the major
Hmm.
uh, circumscription of progressive political imagination was taken care of like in the late 40s and the very beginning of the 50s. But after the legislative victories of the civil rights movement in '65, actually, but Bayard Rustin is pretty much on point about this. He says, okay, well, so we won those victories and they're important. But they're also kind of a backwater of American capitalism. And the main issues that are
You mean in the South?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, and from that point forward, the main issues that confront Black Americans in pursuit of equality and social justice have to do with political economy. It's not clear that it even makes sense to consider the movement going forward as a civil rights movement, and of course that it necessitated in his argument um, the primacy of a different approach to politics and a different kind of coalition. So I mean, Rushton had his own limits and problems that kind of set him up to be dismissed by the Black Powerites as a conservative or a sellout or an Uncle Tom or whatever. But the fact is that Black Power ultimately winds up being like a culturalist response to a political economic problem. But I mean, to go back,
and he's aware. I mean, in a sense, Rustin is aware that the struggle against that racism is really a factor for sort of a conditioning factor of the political constitution of the working class.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So, I mean, anyway, going back to the original question, as I've kind of roamed afield. But yeah, I mean, I think that period was the crucial moment, or the crucial, defeat of the left. And it connects also, I might say, with a view that, with the different, or I guess I should say with a limitation of the different forms of American exceptionalism that have been adduced over the last 2/3 of a century to explain versions of the why-no effective left in the U.S. I think the simplest answer to to all the questions about how it was that the United States never experienced, or we on the left in the United States never experienced the kind of institutional gains that Central and West European social democratic parties did, was that, at the end of World War II, their capitalist classes were by and large weakened and discredited by their association with fascism. Ours came out of the war stronger than ever, rehabilitated, ironically, by the war, and hell bent on a campaign either to roll back or, at a minimum, stop the advance of the left inertial tendencies in the New Deal. So, and that's kind of what we've been living with ever since.
In a way that, there's a coincidence between the way in which the post-war Black question poses itself,
right,
and this issue of the crisis of the organized left. But we'll get into that.
Okay.
So I'll just ask one more, I think, and then let Gregor jump in.
Okay.
And that really has to do with your own, I think a really fascinating account that you give in Past a Critical Theory from 1984.
Yeah.
Of your path to really critical theory,
right,
to Korsch and Lukács and the Frankfurt School, via a bunch of American debates that are usually treated as if they're wholly distinct from anything that Marxism could address. And you talk about the importance of Harold Cruz and Christopher Lasch and others for your own development. So in broad terms, your grappling as a young radical with the Black question led back to Hegelian Marxism that, of course, was developed in Europe and took no specific cognizance of the Black question as it came to be formulated in the 20th century in America.
Right.
How did this return to Marx and the critical theory tradition in Marxism help to clarify your ideas in the 1970s and since?
Oh, wow, okay.
And what about your intellectual trajectory up to that point? What about your intellectual trajectory up to that point led you to Marxism? Right? What about your experience of the civil rights movement in the late 60s led you to Marxism and to this sort of Marxism?
Well, yeah. The second question's kind of easy and sort of cheap. I mean, I kind of inherited the family business, right? I mean, my father was a popular front radical, basically. He was... Ishmael Fleury was one of his, good friends in Chicago, and Tim Black. He was a member of the Joint Council of Dining Car Waiters. It was a red union before he was drafted, and was, so I'd actually been thinking about myself as a Marxist since well before I had any sense what it meant, or a sophisticated sense of what it meant. I mean, so I was kind of raised with, and and well, it's not intuitive or implicit. It's pretty explicit, with an understanding that of class struggle as the key to history and the key to making sense of racial oppression in the U.S. Right? I mean, I recall my dad always saying against the the liberal orthodox view that imposition of the Jim Crow order in the South at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th represented a victory of the white working class in politics, and and I recall from as early as my very low double digits in age, my father saying, kind of joking, I said, well, I mean, isn't it funny that if they took power, the only thing that they'd want for themselves is the white supremacy, right? I mean, wouldn't you think they'd want some redistribution or some other stuff, stuff on that order? So, I mean, in that sense, and while I was active in what was in effect Black Power politics in North Carolina. I was in college, I was always like the guy on the Marxist edge of the discourse. So
this is when you were in the SWP.
This was before I was in the SWP, when I was in the SWP, and after I was in the SWP. Because I was in the SWP really for a little more than a year, actually. I think that's right. Yeah, probably a little more than a year. And but
so this sort of flirtation with black nationalism was something that you argued with your dad about?
Well, we actually argued more about Trotskyism than black nationalism.
Right.
Which is one reason, frankly, that I've come to perceive my flirtation as a version of delayed adolescent rebellion, right?
Funny.
But in practical terms, what would appeal to me about it really was the SWP was the only organization on the conventional left, right, on the Marxist left, that had what I thought was a reasonable line on Black power and black nationalism, right? And it's a sort of line that people like Earl O'Farrill and Bob Allen and some of those you mentioned in the question actually also embraced. So to me, the SWP and that flavor of American Trotskyism at that moment appealed partly as a way, I may even have said this in the Past to Critical Theory essay, as a way to harmonize the nationalist, populist, substrate of Black power with Marxism. And to fast forward a bit, I guess what.
So you're saying that this was the achievement of the SWP's line?
Yeah.
And that this is a kind of a broader agenda beyond them that these other works participated in.
Right. No, that's right. Right, that's right. And I left the SWP pretty much for organizational reasons. And it's kind of ironic, actually, because one of the immediate precipitants was that they had, this was in a period when the SWP was trying to invent itself as having created and been the driving force behind the student mobilization against the war, and they had invested a lot organizationally and ideologically in doing support or in their, like in touting the cases of SWP members who had gone into the military and were being persecuted, right, for their radicalism in the military. And
okay.
And the irony was that as this effort was picking up steam organizationally, they wanted us in North Carolina, in the Central Piedmont, to focus all of our activities on you doing support for anti-war GIs at Fort Bragg, like a little over an hour away, and at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, a little more like 3 or 4 hours away. And I balked at this because I just thought that we should be doing other stuff that's more local and pertinent. And the irony is that a few months later, I was approached by a couple of people I knew to be part of a group that went down to Fayetteville, actually, and to set up an anti-war GI organizing project, and I did it. So I wound up doing, but it wasn't but it wasn't the same kind of support stuff. But anyway, like the long and short of it is that
whereas you were more interested in what in developing in working with local labor organizations.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly right. Right, that's exactly right. So what happened was, like, I spent probably the next 3 years, right, doing off-campus organizing of one sort or another, mainly with the GI support stuff and with poor people's organizations, right, that this group that I later went to work for had been organizing around the state. And I mean, by the early 70s, I could see that that with respect to the evolution or the evolving dynamics in black politics, the left forces had pretty much been outflanked and kind of helped to outflank themselves. That's when I decided to go to graduate school, and I was feeling kind of frustrated.
Like around the time of Gary.
Oh yeah, exactly. And in fact, I was involved in the North Carolina, organizing both for the Gary Convention and for the first African Liberation Day march. So, and like with all that stuff, but especially the Gary stuff, and especially in a state like North Carolina, you could see how the class contradictions played out in black politics very, very clearly. And the first waves of black elected officials and the pressures that they were under and the limitations that they had, right, and all that, and also the sort of combative or contentious interest-based organizing among working class and poor black communities that was largely funded by groups that could trace their funding streams at some point or other back to the Ford Foundation, were increasingly shifting more and more toward this notions of community economic development and these more or less fanciful ideas about being able to depend on what's basically moral exhortation to do the work of customs control, basically, to develop an autonomous black economy, and that just always seemed fanciful. And as the movement shifted more and more in that direction, you didn't have to be smart to see which way things were going, right? You just had not to be invested in the way they were going.
Right.
So it's in that context that I really spent a little while being kind of frustrated at the interpretive options that seemed available to me to make sense of this, because there was a way that Plekhanovite Marxism just didn't connect with anything concrete, and there's no way, and there's like that teleological leap of faith, basically, that never really made it for me. And actually, I mean,
and the ideology is so elaborate.
Right. No, that's right.
The Black nationalism.
Yes, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, it's well, in fact, it's not even ideology; it's an ontology, really. So I found myself in this moment, and I guess all these things were going on at the same time when, in the aftermath of that first African Liberation Day march, there was a dynamic that people kind of tried to, or that evolved, or people tried to force out of it to create like a permanent African Liberation Day committee, right, which became the African Liberation Support Committee. And the people who were central in that effort were Pan-Africanists, but they were Pan-Africanists of two stripes. One was the cultural nationalist crowd around Donnell Lee, Hakeem Matobuti, and then Amiri Baraka, and others, and Karinga. Mm-hmm. And then there was another tendency that was mainly like a southern axis, Greensboro, Atlanta, and Nashville and New Orleans, where people were more connected with at least anti-imperialist, Marxism. I mean, like the New Orleans chapter was dominated by the Black Workers Congress, and the Atlanta chapter was kind of the same. And the Nashville, Greensboro axis was like another group of Black Powerites become Pan-Africanists, becoming Marxist-Leninists, like of some sort, or at least anti-imperialists. And the thing that struck me about that, of course, was that what they were drawn to was that sort of, the same kind of mechanistic understanding of what Marxism as a science was, right? And I guess this was around the time that I actually stumbled across Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, mm-hmm. Which really appealed to me initially, in the extent to which it spoke to the frustrations that I was having with seeing what looked like the only interpretive options available to me being either that crude Plekhanovite understanding of Marxism or some version of liberalism, what I guess I would now call activist ism, drawing on Doc Henwood and others,
right?
And the black nationalism, which always seemed both evasive of confronting the conditions of the dynamics driving actually existing capitalism in the U.S. and and it seemed more and more like the anti-imperialist focus was a way to kind of split the difference between Marxism and nationalism, right? And that's what sort of appealed to.
This is all the Maoism that you're talking about.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That's what appealed about Maoism. And I'll be honest. I mean, I had, I read Mao with some interest in myself, and
sure.
And I mean, some of my friends, especially some of the more intellectually oriented types in the SWP, this was after I'd left, but scratched their heads about how I could find both the Frankfurt School and Maoism appealing. And I was kind of happy years later to come across Alvin Gouldner's The Two Marxisms, in which he makes an argument that makes that make sense, right? That there are these voluntarist and economistic tendencies in Marxism, and they're both there at the core, and as part of, and the critical tension, between them is arguably part of the creativity of Marxism, mm-hmm. And as a way in which people in the Western Marxist tradition who stressed the significance of the cultural domain, broadly construed, were open to the open-endedness of history in kind of the same way that the Maoists were. But that's just a quirk that maybe
Uh-huh.
Feel better, kind of, or I feel
But
like I had a response to a question I didn't want to deal with in the first place.
but there's still this funny sort of like sort of jump from one track.
Hmm.
I would imagine that you were sort of frustrated with the Maoists on their sort of slotting
Oh,
of the
yeah.
black question into the national and colonial questions, and anti-imperialism. And
Well,
it's a kind of a funny shift to go from that to Marxism and philosophy.
oh yeah. What? Yeah. No, I can imagine. Well, I mean, I didn't. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, um,
So,
I think. Well, I mean, I was always critical of the domestic colony thesis, or at least by the time I started graduate school, I've got a seminar paper that I wrote around here around 1973, probably. That was what I thought a pretty trenchant, critique of that formulation.
right.
I haven't been able to find it for a year or so, but I know it's around here somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And when I find it now that I have a scanner, I'll scan it,
Mm-hmm.
because that just didn't make sense. But one thing, um, I guess, what principally appealed to me about Mao and Maoism had to do with with approaches to organizing and the centrality of the notion of protracted struggle, right? What, what appeal, but it always seemed to me. Oh, did we lose somebody?
No, I'm here,
Oh,
Gregor.
okay.
I'm
Gre-
here. I'm here.
Gregor probably
Oh,
got some note or something.
okay. Um, but but it always seemed to me, right, more like um, a an interpretive framework that um, that could be helpful in trying to make sense of how to do what I still think is the fundamental fundamental warrant of politics, which is to unite the many to defeat the few. Speaking of the Maoist slogans,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and in that sense, as an approach to movement building, right? And to critique, theoretical critique, as an element of the project of anti-capitalist or building an anti-capitalist movement in the U.S. So one thing that frustrated hell out of me, in fact, um, um, I did write a critique of what I called scientistic socialism in the mid '70s, was the tendency to look for catechism and formulae, right? No matter what the guise was, whether it was Maoism, Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, the seven principles of the Nguzo Saba, or whatever the hell else, right? And the millenarian quality of all that kind of radicalism was predicated, and I began to think more or less opportunistically on evasion of of trying to think through in an historical and dialectical materialist way that the tensions and the contradictions driving the sort of capitalist order that we lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And it made all kinds of opportunistic alliances possible too, right? I remember I ran into a guy I knew who was who actually went on to be the director of the Schomburg Center for a long time. But at that point, we were in Atlanta together. I bumped into him in the supermarket just around the time that the mayor had fired 2,200 striking sanitation workers, and this guy's office at the Institute of the Black World was dependent on funding from the CETA program, and he gave me a very elaborate, high theoretical explanation of how the mayor didn't have any control over that because he was hemmed in so tightly by the powers of capital, blah 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 blah, right?
Uh-huh.
Which also brought to mind something you've probably heard or read me saying.
Mm-hmm.
someplace. That's another thing my father always said, that from one perspective, ideology is the mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you want to believe you hold with what advances your interest in the world.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Oh, yeah, go
so,
ahead,
sorry, do you
Gregor.
want to finish that thought, or because otherwise, I mean, we've been tracing sort of the trajectory of your thought
Mhm.
through the '60s and '70s now, and maybe this might be it sort of definitely peaked sort of in your very significant 1979 essay for Telos,
Mm-hmm.
Black Particularity Reconsidered, in which you seem to be grappling sort of with the consolidation of nationalism in black politics, and you take that sort of as an opportunity to kind of reflect on the specter of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And so you write that the dismantlement of the system of racial segregation only removed a fetter blocking the possibility of emancipation. In this context, computation of the quote-unquote gains of the '60s can begin only at the point where that extraordinary subjugation was eliminated, end of quote.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go on to try and clarify what it would mean to come to grips historically with the civil rights movement. On one hand, its success or its failure. So the civil rights movement, as you say, dismantled Jim Crow.
Right.
On the other hand, however, an ideological confusion emerged coming out of the '60s that it was in some ways more intractable and opaque than had what come before. So just very basically, is this a fair characterization of your view in this essay? And perhaps more significantly, to what degree do we continue to live today in the wake and aftermath of
Right.
the civil rights movement?
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I was just up at the McAllister in St. Paul. You're giving
Mm-hmm.
a talk this past week, and an old Telos comrade of mine, Frank Adler, teaches there and has been there for some time. And it's the first time I've discussed that essay in a while, because a number of the undergraduates there had actually read it, which is kind of interesting. And then walking back from to the political science department from one event, one of the precocious undergrads actually mentioned artificial negativity, which is a term I hadn't thought about in a while. But yeah, I mean, I think first of all, yeah, that is, I think, essentially a fair characterization of the argument. And I guess I would tease it out. I mean, there's some points I probably would make in a different way now, of course, um, but I think that it's also correct that 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 if we can look at the uh, at the terms on which the civil rights movement was successful, um, that actually um, began, um, or well, I wouldn't say it began, but but it was certainly a big advance in the direction of class consolidation in black politics, right? For reasons that I discuss in the article, and and I mean, to the extent that black office holders of whatever sort
Mm-hmm.
are just like other office holders and don't have any interest in popular mobilization, then one of the outcomes of the civil rights movement becomes a political demobilization that continues over the '80s and '90s. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think I think an instructive moment, ironically, given how this moment is often understood, is that just a few months before, in fact, it was the immediate impetus for Jesse Jackson's declaration of his presidential campaign in 1984. He and Coretta Scott King and others in the civil rights establishment had called a march on Washington, or in Washington, um, in August of 1983. The main purpose of which was to commemorate the fact that there had been a march on that spot 20 years earlier. And I took that occurring as it did halfway through Reagan's first term, when the substance of his agenda was pretty clear. I took that as a signal, unintentional, from the black, political class that they were fresh out of ideas and they had no way to, or for that, or way to respond to this counterattack from the right, and by and large, we're not even capable of articulating a response because of their own class or class-based confusions about race and injustice and inequality, basically. And I mean, since then, I just think it's been more and more of the same, and worse and worse and worse.
I mean, in a way, it's always sort of figured as the transition from the South to the North.
Mm-hmm.
Or the moment of riots, a kind of Watts moment,
right,
in the '60s in terms of the crisis of the civil rights movement. But what I always found so fascinating about that essay is the way that you treat black nationalism as kind of paving the way to the new society, to essentially to neoliberalism.
Right. And frankly, I think that my critical perspective on that has only gotten sharper, right? In the last, what's that, 36 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, well, I don't think the critique's gotten sharper because I've gotten sharper. I think the critique's gotten sharper because the dynamics have matured, right? In fact, like the email that I sent Spencer was when we first got on the phone was a little comment about Rauner's appropriation of diversity discourse
Right.
openly, right, as a front for his attack on the working class. And I just said,
Right.
I mean, it feels like both Walter Michaels and I should send him a thank you note. And once this is over, we win.
Right.
But of course.
But the reality always never ceases to surprise.
No, I know. No. I mean, absolutely. I mean, right, because I also said in that note that on the other hand, right? I mean, the various flavors of identitarians and activists are can't even notice this is going on, or if they do notice, dimly are incapable of interpreting it, or much less of responding to it effectively. But I mean, thank God for them that Kanye West has just provoked like another race-tinged crisis in pop culture, because that's their métier, basically.
You mean the Oscars thing?
Grammys.
Grammys, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the grammar. That I felt like that was staged almost.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I mean,
Beck seemed ready for it.
He's an actor. He's
right.
an actor.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is the case, man. That I mean, not only is it not possible to parody this stuff anymore, but it's all beginning to feel more and more like orchestrated bread and circuses. It's got the it's got the aspect of either a dystopian sci-fi narrative or idiocracy, or some combination of the two.
Yeah. So, but in this sense, can we actually then still speak of like the aftermath of the civil rights movement, as I asked before, because that seems to be to have moved away from a lot of the tensions that the civil rights movement was trying to raise within American society. This just seems like historical amnesia at this point. If we were to follow your criticism of that, and but perhaps this perhaps connects neatly to our next question, in which you, in the same essay in Black Particularity, you considered, you also criticized the mass organization model of politics.
Right.
And so you're right there that this model was built on the assumption of a homogeneity of Black political interests to be dealt with through community leadership. And you're right, it is this notion of Black community that has blocked development of a radical critique in the civil rights movement by contraposing an undifferentiated mass to a leadership stratum representing it. End of quote. So, in the context of our conversation, if you were to update this critique, again from 79 to our present moment, what would that look like?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, I guess I'd say, for one thing, like it would look a lot like, mutatis mutandis, the moment at the beginning of the 20th century when Booker T. Washington and others, both his antagonists as well as his pals, were vying to establish what Ken Warren has described as managerial authority over the Negro question. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where we are now. And in a funny way, I think another way it's possible to look at the arc of this politics, of black politics, is that, from like emancipation to the defeat of populism and imposition of the Jim Crow order, mm-hmm. You had a fairly open politics, class asymmetrical with respect to race in particular, but with Black free people improvising and sometimes aligning with white, sometimes not, to pursue to engage in politics as a mechanism for making their lives better, and substantively for defining what making their lives better would actually mean concretely. So that gets squashed, and then until the mid-20s or really into the 30s, you've got like this, what's understood to be Black politics. While there were certainly, as Judith Stein points out, Black people forming trade unions and fighting employers and all that kind of stuff. But what's understood as Black politics is this elite enterprise that's directed from, or that has a dual direction toward prominent elites. That's about articulating the interests of the popular Black population, and of course always doing so in ways that are consistent with what the dominant elites would be prepared to hear, and with presenting themselves, like in the other direction, as an organically organic leadership of that popular Black population. One thing I think that I would add now that's been under recognized is the extent to which the claims to organic race leadership themselves hinged on the premises of Victorian race theory, which is kind of interesting. But then, like in the mid-30s, you see the emergence of this popular front, or this mass kind of direct action politics that emerges out of the environment of that period, and that is an active and dynamic and partly constitutive strain of Black political activity until the victories of the civil rights movement, and the emergence of Black political regimes in big cities in the late 60s, early 70s, or between the late 60s and the late 70s. And then what we've seen since then, at least since Reagan, if not earlier, but increasingly as time moves toward the present, a reassertion of a Black PMC as a tutorial leadership class. Basically, right? That sort of hinges on
right
underclass ideology, right? Which which by definition disqualifies um, a significant section of the black population from having the authority to articulate its own concerns. And it struck me for a long time too that what disappears from contemporary accounts of or relatively contemporary, I mean, discourse of black politics, and this goes back to the 90s and all that crap that comes out of the universities, is a working class, right? I mean, there's no space for an autonomous working class that's capable of articulating its own voice. So, especially like in the 90s, with the emergence of cultural studies discourse and people like Robin Kelly and the vast majority of English professors claiming that the black experience is opaque and unknowable to those outside, and it's possible to get access to it only through these skilled racial interpreters.
Right.
Right.
And
in this sense, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, you go on.
Oh, I was just going to ask a very brief follow-up in that, coming out of sort of, I mean, you've devoted a lot of your recent writings to sort of expressing your frustrations sort of with these sorts of politics. But I guess one of the problems is, of course, that it's also become very hard to disentangle, between left and right here. Because
Right.
if we assume that, black population is posed as a homogeneous mass, then the question is, well, what about class distinctions, and what about political distinctions that are
Right.
kind of glossed over in that sort of discourse?
Right.
So I guess one of the problems is that it's become increasingly hard to dissect sort of what's left and what's right here. Would you say that is a problem too?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think as you go through, we go through everyday life, I think a good operating assumption is that any person who has access to the public microphone is on the right. Which includes the whole, all of the MSNBC stable and the rest of that. I mean,
Right.
well, yeah, because the issue frames are like that, right? I mean, when I watched the Selma film, which I hadn't really made up my mind about doing until I went to Canada, my friends wanted to see it. I was struck again at how the interpretive tropes are like always the same, right? There's always, the tale of the extraordinary, larger-than-life black individual who's both, dignified and race-conscious at the same time, overcoming great adversity, which is the reason that DuVernay ultimately had to construct LBJ in the way she did, because a black person can't have any allies because they're all against us all the time, and it's like that over and over and over. My son teaches at Illinois State, and in fact, actually, their Black History Month speaker is today. He just told me this morning, but he's remarked to me over the years that the MLK Day speaker, I think, is the one that the student affairs people have, and they're under pressure, both from the student body and the administration, to produce turnouts. And what the students want, since they don't know any better, is people who are famous and whom you see on TV. So they've had, and for several years now, I mean, he was able, like the engineer, to engineer both Yolani Guinier and then our own Karen Lewis, right, as speakers a couple of years. But they're mainly these self-esteem hustlers, right? And he said, like, the narratives are always the same, right? I mean, first there's a...
I was just watching, they're showing the movie Glory on Headline News, and they've got a panel that's discussing it, kind of commercial break by commercial break. And, the one thing that they can't come to terms with is... the soldiers making history as soldiers,
right,
and the unity of purpose with their abolitionist officers.
Yep.
and the whole question of military discipline.
Yep.
Which is all actually at the heart of the film and of the history.
Right.
But
Yeah,
it's precisely what isn't black. Black people in Union uniform,
right.
actually destroying slavery, isn't black history enough for them.
I know, like it's absolutely incredible, man. I had friends, and I thought maybe this was in part like a generational thing, and it may be, but I had friends who, at the time the film came out, turned their nose up at it because of the white officers, and I thought, well, so what else would there have been? But even so, what's the, there's another way to look at that issue. I've got it downloaded on my laptop, and I'll sometimes watch the James Island battle scene when they engage for the first time in combat, just to lift my spirits. Right? I think it's a fabulous film, but you put your thumb on it, right? The idea, and man, you talk about an ideology that's like a fraternal twin to neoliberalism, right? Because it really is like a Thatcherite discourse, right? That black authenticity is doing it all on your own, as extraordinary individuals and their families, right?
Without any help from the accumulated military science,
no, right,
concentrated at West Point,
right. Well, yeah, and the idea, and this goes back to, I guess, my reaction to the criticism of the Lincoln film, which is, how is it that acknowledging that it was the presence of the Union Army that enabled such, black flight from the plantations as occurred during the treasonous insurrection, how is it that is supposed to besmirch black agency, right? No, it's incredible. But again, I think it's incredibly revealing as a class position. And by the way, I saw, when George Lucas made that abominable live-action cartoon about the Tuskegee Airmen, Red Tails. I saw him on the Daily Show, I think, one night when he was hyping the film, and he actually compared it to Glory, which he disparaged as being about white officers leading black soldiers to their death, and said that by contrast, what he wanted to do was a movie with black heroes. And so it's like that. That's what he did.
But it reminded me of what you were saying about the forgotten histories that Judith Stein was respecting labor organizing,
right?
In the age of this sort of in a sense black managerial politics becomes black history.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah. But yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, and it's consolidated as black history, but through the institutionalization of black studies.
But it aligns itself, ironically, with the liberal left, whereas. So I think that's one of the problems, sort of, to that's why I asked the follow-up earlier on about sort of how to dissect sort of that web of anti-racist discourse,
right,
that aligns itself with the liberal left, and yet kind of raises a lot of. So, what do you make of that? Because at this, as leftists, sort of this is part now of our discourse, and yet what you diagnose in many ways appears sort of as an elite project. You mentioned the professional managerial class. So I guess what happened like in between the 70s and now for it to overshadow so much of left liberal debate, whereas it could have been just as much diagnosed as a phenomenon of the right.
Well, no. Yes, I think that's right. But actually, can I ask you guys to hold on for a second?
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
right back.
Yep.
Oh, hi, I'm sorry, guys. I'm back.
How are you doing on time?
Oh no, I'm okay.
You're okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
I was going to ask you, Adolph, if just to put, how pointedly can we put it? If it would, if in this, and this goes back to what I was asking, to the questions about black particularity reconsidered. But, in a sense, the insights that maybe reflect back on history generally. Which is the way in which black nationalism seems to me a kind of, in a way you can see it as a kind of adaptation to the failure of socialism. That certainly, I see that as one way of viewing your thesis in '79. That in a sense, the failure to be able to think beyond the Voting Rights Act, to in a sense the way in which, in other words, the civil rights movement and the radicalism of the '60s were ultimately bound up with a kind of reproletarianization, and the issue of the political leadership and constitute, the political leadership of that reproletarianization that ultimately gave us neoliberalism. And in that sense, it seems to me that the American black question is poignant because of how profoundly proletarian this society is. That failures around coming to terms with the black question are in a sense celebrated together with the collapse of the imagination of socialism. I don't know what you.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, I had a couple thoughts, right? And one of them at least kind of speaks back to just some things I might stress more now in that piece. Well, I mean, one thought is quite mundane, right? It's that all said and done, nationalism is always a class ideology, and it's always the ideology of the same class, right? So there shouldn't be anything that's surprising about the fact that, and I mean, this is a point that Cruz sort of made, but in his own way, but that well, I mean, the idea of the nation, after all, is like a notion, or I mean, the nation as a coherent, unitary entity,
Right.
is a bourgeois ideology. So, and it makes sense, right, to a bourgeoisie or a rising bourgeoisie or an aspiring petite bourgeoisie, right? I mean, all the from Bangladesh to National Socialism, right? All points in between. So that's one thing about it. But with the less mundane, although I might think in some ways more mundane point, is that in retrospect we could see now that the black political classes that consolidated in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act, North and South, but especially in cities, were aligned from the very beginning. But again, like twins in the womb, with the growth-oriented, or the more radically growth-oriented elements in local bourgeois classes.
What do you mean growth oriented?
Well, like aggressively downtown redevelopment oriented.
Uh-huh.
What I mean, segments at as opposed to the more staid and well, yeah, I mean, well, but I guess the best way to put them, but I guess the best way to describe them would be radically developmentalist, right? And who felt themselves, no less than black aspirants, hemmed in by patterns of everyday politics and patterns of alliances with the local partisan organizations and their patronage networks. So blacks had an interest, or aspiring black politicians had an interest, as well as something of a popular one, in breaking through to get to those to get access to the patronage networks from which they've been excluded. And the developmentalist wing of the local bourgeoisie had an interest, also in breaking up the entrenched patterns of the political alliances and coalitions. So we're starting to see now case studies that show this history in useful detail for one city or another. I mean, over time, Clarence Stone's work on Atlanta was pioneering in this regard. But Kent Germany's book on New Orleans, I think it's called New Orleans After the Promises, which focuses, specifically on the role of war and poverty and Great Society agencies in facilitating the formation of the sort of new alliance. Jay Arena's book.
So in terms of in other words, you're talking about like fostering a class of people who, in a sense, genuinely have a program for the reconstitution of capitalism in the 1970s and 80s.
Absolutely. And it's a program that's in effect neoliberalism before the name.
Right.
So I mean, that's kind of and I wouldn't say, I wouldn't argue that this was an inevitable unfolding of the terms on which the civil rights movement was won. But I suppose I could say that, since as a political scientist, what we do most effectively is predict what's already happened and show that it had to have happened. But I think
that's probably why the political scientists love the language of path dependency.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Like every now and then, when they talk about it, I feel like saying, "Put your hands on the desk where I can see them."
Oh, it was so much better when we could call it right Hegelianism, and it was a genuinely elaborate and
right.
ideology.
Right, right. I mean, absolutely. I mean, now it's just public relations driven bullshit.
Let's try to move forward and finish up, Adolph. I really appreciate your spending time with us this morning.
And I'm glad we could work it out. But I'm enjoying the conversation.
Absolutely. Coming back to your Harper's essay, you say there that we need to acknowledge that no politically effective force exists on the American left today, and that the present task lies in rebuilding an effective labor movement in the U.S. In this context, it is significant that in the mid-1990s you were involved in the Labor Party project,
right,
which was meant to be a challenge to the Clinton Democrats.
Right.
Could you explain your role in the Labor Party, what its aims were, and where you see the reasons for the project's demise, or at least it's being put on hold? In other words, what are the sort of lessons of that, and what do you take from it?
Right. Yeah. Well, the short answer to the question of my role is that my role was to do whatever they wanted me to do. So, because in my heart, I have no difficulty acknowledging that I'm an apparatchik, basically. that's my orientation to politics. But um,
We need a lot more honesty like that.
well, and I think I had some of the kids at McAllister either pausing to think things through or maybe squirming in their seats a bit when I suggested that from my perspective, the revolution doesn't begin until you have control of the planning ministry and the Ministry of the Interior. But well, yeah. I mean, it was. I mean, I don't know if you guys have read the article that Mark Dudzik and I did in the 2015 issue of the Socialist Register. I can send it to you if you haven't seen it, because I know it's behind a paywall.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea was kind of a straightforward one, right? To build an independent political party of the working class anchored in the trade union movement, because you can't be a working class party unless you're anchored in the trade union movement, because that's where
Right.
the working class is organized politically as a class to the extent that it's organized anywhere. I mean, politically as a class.
Right.
I'm sure we all know, the immediate historical precipitants. It grew out of people who've been or the networks of trade union activists who had been active in the anti-concessions movement in the 80s and late 70s. There's no accident, therefore, that we were centered disproportionately in the industrial sector. And a slogan that some people had mixed emotions about, but that in one way encapsulates the idea is that the bosses have two parties, we should have one of our own. And we tried to so we tried to build around a program that was worked out in a participatory way, but shaped by a vision of a pursuit of class power, and with the idea that we were not interested in organizing the left or in aggregating left stances, but we wanted to be like a political party anchored in the working class. And that's what we tried to organize around. We were we were always focused more on institutional affiliations than on individual memberships, because we knew that the key was going to be having the political capacity, right, and the broader institutional capacity of the organized trade union movement behind what we were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we were relatively successful up to a point with winning and retaining institutional affiliations. I think we lost international affiliates through merger. We lost. I don't think that there was. No, I take that back. I think there's only one local union that ever
disaffiliated.
And all the rest of it was through attrition, right? And merger, right? The locals I went out of business. We had, but we hit a threshold in the trade union movement, and there were some international unions that had that came together around portions of the critique at the most general level, were part of a conversation, but just couldn't get themselves to do to take the next steps. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. What among the issues in the experience that helped me to see just in very concrete ways the kind of problems that existed among the left was the way that our approach to electoral politics came up, right? That I mean, as you guys know, most of the American Trotskyist movement is of the view that you build a movement through running candidates for office. We didn't share that view. We always considered that the electoral realm is a site for consolidation of victories that have been won on the plane of social movement organizing. So that was like a bone of contention throughout, but it wasn't just the Trotskyists. I mean, I was surprised by the mid '80s to see how much stake, how many people who identified themselves as leftists or even radicals put on backing electoral candidacies and running candidates. And as I think I've said most recently in a little piece I did in response to these guys who were denouncing Karen Lewis as a sellout even before she declared, that there's a way that I think they, like the Democrats, vastly exaggerate the significance of elections. But that said, we got to a point where our members urged that it was time for us to consider taking the electoral option, and we did. We, as I know you know, we undertook a campaign to win a ballot line in South Carolina, and we picked South Carolina for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the South Carolina State AFL-CIO was actually the only state fed to be an affiliate of the Labor Party, and unsurprisingly, therefore, we had good connections in the trade union movement down there with the Charleston Longshoremen and like other groups. But the other reason was that we thought that since so much of the now is not the timeline for engaging in independent politics hinged on claims that the electorate, even the working class electorate, isn't ready for an explicit appeal to a working class politics. We thought, frankly, that since South Carolina is one of, if not the most backward state in the union, if we could win a ballot line there, that that would be a lesson. And I wasn't fully prepared for this until it happened, but I had a comparable experience in 1992 when I worked in the Harkin campaign. That the more successful we were, the more, the response from the skeptics was to raise the threshold of significance. Right. So we won a ballot, which I think is already a statement, right? More than 16,500 the registered voters in South Carolina said the state should recognize a Labor Party. But what happened was the Working Families Party and naysayers in the AFL-CIO and those leftists who operate with a different style of politics said, well, but they haven't run anybody, they haven't won anything, right? So in that milieu, we decided to put the thing in mothballs, right? Because we didn't want, we felt that we were at a point where we should either grow or die, and we didn't want the thing to stay around on the edges of public discourse in the trade union movement or in the left as a sort of how there's a tendency among a strain of leftist and left liberals to freeze a moment in time and put it behind a velvet rope, right, to honor it, and we didn't want to be that,
right.
and we also didn't want to, be, the carcass of a vibrant, left organization that the sectarian groups start fighting over. So we wanted to maintain control of it on our own terms. We put the thing, we shut down operations. Basically, and I think you guys have seen the articles that Mark wrote, and Mark and Catherine Isaac, who was like the longtime secretary treasurer, and the central brains basically of the national office, wrote, and I think those are both, accurate and strong estimations of what it was we were trying to do, and our understanding of the constraints.
So, just to, in a sense, frame it against the background of some of what we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the, why no socialism in America question.
Right.
In what ways were sort of peculiarly American historical issues at stake, or how were they raised as specters in the Labor Party experiment? And how was the sort of epochal condition in the late 1990s in terms of a kind of a global discrediting of socialism, not only due to the fall of the Soviet Union, but I think more generally the kind of exhaustion of the new left.
Right. Well, yeah, no, that's very interesting. I remember shortly after, a few months after our founding convention, I was in the Bay Area for a council meeting, and I was driving across the Bay Bridge with Tony Mazzocchi, and we were just kind of shooting the shit about one thing or another, as we often did. And I said to him, God, it occurs to me, that there's a way that we're able to do what the CP and other groups like that couldn't do, partly because the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, at least not nominally, has opened some space for us. And he said, yeah, it's absolutely right. Right. And so in that sense, nobody in South Carolina even tried to red bait us. Of course, they didn't even try to gay bait us, right? At the same time that that the Republicans there were trying to use a ballot initiative that would write the statutory prohibition against same-sex marriage that already existed into the state constitution. Right, and that never came up, right? And we were working, flea markets, right, and what working class neighborhoods and stuff, all over the state, and nobody ever brought any of that stuff up to us, right? Because we just sort of opened the conversation with jobs, healthcare, education, housing, etc. Right, and it also, by the way, this is a tad off point, but it also brought home to me how much, in fact, that whole experience did. How much both the Democrats and the Republicans in South Carolina were invested in defining race as the central fault line in politics.
No doubt.
Actually, can I ask you to hold on just a second?
Sure.
Hello, Elizabeth? I think I missed it.
You can call her back if you want.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. Hi, how are you? I'm sorry. Oh, yep, all right. Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Yeah, good. That's what I thought it was, that her friend's kid is digging our cars out now, so. Yeah, so, but how, the extent to which both those parties are committed, right, to having race be the central fault line in politics, both because it makes the electoral forecasting more predictable. For instance, the Democrats would not at that time authorize a black person to run in a district that's between something like 35 and the 55% black, or maybe 35 and 50% black, because they would define those as black interest districts, but not as black candidate districts, because they understood that it's in districts of that sort in which white Democrats had the best chance of winning office, and then once such white candidates won office, the state party spent a lot of its time trying to keep them from becoming Republicans, right? But it's very clear, though, that electoral politics was the most racialized domain of social life in South Carolina. And I think that's becoming more and more true in much of the country.
It's a lot like prison life.
Yeah.
What about the issue of kind of exhaustion of imagination as to what the reforms can contribute to? In other words, the loss of an imagination of an actually different form of society.
Right. Oh, no. Right. Absolutely. And
as a kind of a condition, or a kind of atmospheric condition.
Right.
In that moment of history.
Well, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that was a huge, huge problem, and a skepticism about institutions. And so, both those, I think, attest to the larger victory of neoliberalism, and as a corollary, the extent to which the left that does exist is a left that's articulated entirely within the ontological framework of neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Occupy, for God's sake. What could be more the child of neoliberal understanding of the way the world works? It's like all process, right? No vision, and completely individualist. That's one reason that the 1% versus the 99% never did anything for me. I know a lot of people want to believe that this opens a space, but it's really pretty puerile way of understanding inequality.
Right. Adolph?
Yes.
Thanks so much.